any big event can serve as a catalyst for change. So it's not impossible. And I've spoken to people who have been through these seminars and it allowed them to make a big change. And they will look back and say that that was a great thing. And you can't argue that allowing somebody to feel empowered to maybe make a decision that they wouldn't have otherwise made, and that decision's worked out well for them, you can't take that away from the person and say, well, actually, no, that the seminar didn't help, because I really think that it did.
Hello, and welcome to the Personal Pizza Podcast. I'm Simcha Levenberg, your host. Today's episode it's a remote episode. Our guest, John Hunter, was unavailable to come because he is in South Africa. But the book is awesome. It's called Manufacturing Mania. It's about large group awareness trainings and his dopamine hypothesis that he created after he had a mental health crisis in the middle of like a 5-day course, personal improvement, self-improvement. And so from there, it inspired him to study what's happening in some of these programs and to try to figure out ways to make them better and safer for adults and people everywhere. Today's pizza it's a tough day out here. It's a Neapolitan pizza that's just stretching. It's just, the pizza almost feels selfish today. Like it doesn't even want me to be involved. So let's dig in there. Let's hope this turns out well. And I hope you enjoy this episode. Dr. John Hunter, thank you for coming to talk to me today. I appreciate it.
Good to be here.
I have the weirdest connection, which is that my wife took a semester abroad in the late 90s, and she was in Pietermaritzburg at KWZN, KwaZulu-Natal. Is that your university?
It is actually, yeah. So I did my master's in psychology at Pietermaritzburg University, and so it's the University of KwaZulu-Natal, but the Maritzburg campus is where I did my master's year.
Yeah, you're the second person I've ever met who went there. So you and my wife.
It's a relatively small city, but the university is quite big. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. She was there for 7 months and she really loved it. And to date, whenever somebody comes from South Africa, we talk to somebody, she has to talk all about Pietermaritzburg and her whole experiences there. Cool. So an odd connection. I just wanted to share.
It's strange. I was actually in touch with a professor of psychiatry from Canada this morning, and I was asking her about doing some work on bipolar disorder in South Africa, and she said, "Yeah, no, actually, my husband's from Dundee in KwaZulu-Natal," and it's like, well, okay, yeah. So
it's all connected. I think first it'd be a good place to start, and you're very good with kind of laying down some definitions. And so I was wondering if you could give me a concise definition of large group awareness training. Like, what's an LGAT?
Yeah, an ELGAT, or large group awareness training. And I think it's difficult to give a concise definition that's going to kind of cover all angles. But the way that I would define it based on my own research is it's a seminar that tends to last for, 2, 3, 4, 5 days. It's often billed as being a personal development seminar. It involves a lot of psychological stress for the first sort of 80% of the training. The last sort of day of the training, there's a lot of love and affirmation, and you've graduated, so social reward. So it has that kind of structure, and it tends to result in these very euphoric, transformational experiences in most of the participants. And I'd say that that's really the core of what they are. I'm sure that there are a lot of organizations that might be able to kind of skirt around and avoid that definition. So there are other things that can be looked at, but that's how I would define a sort of generic ELGAT. Right.
Now, there was a time in like the 70s and the 80s where an ELGAT was not like a pejorative term, correct?
No, in fact, so the earliest ELGATs were EST, which is Erhard Seminars Training. I would say that was the first one that at least became very popular. So that started in 1971. In 1974, there was another very popular one that started called LifeSpring. And there were various articles, journal articles written by academics, which described them as large group awareness trainings. And it seemed to be without any negative response from the people that were running the organization. So Werner Erhard was the person running EST, and then later Werner Erhard and Associates, which offered the forum as their sort of key seminar. There were a number of studies done by various researchers in the late 1980s that were done with the approval and endorsement and support of Werner Erhard and Associates, and they referred to the forum as a large group awareness training. They referred to EST as a large group awareness training. LifeSpring, again, apparently without any pushback from anyone running these organizations.
Yeah. And now it does this, the 3 to 5 day framework has now been adopted by a number of people. Like obviously like Tony Robbins does this, and the Mankind Project does versions of this, and Dr. Joe Dispenza. I mean, this is very, very topical. It seems like it's a great way to monetize and take money from people. Yeah. What are the ethical issues involved?
I think it starts off with with informed consent. So, I mean, I don't know if you've had a look at my websites. I've written an article or an essay called The First Rule of Large Group Awareness Trainings. And this is because the first thing that you're kind of told when you go into these seminars is you can't really tell anyone about what actually takes place in them. And often the marketing or the sales done by these organizations is through word of mouth. So you've got people graduating, telling family, friends, work colleagues that they really need to participate. It's this great thing. It's going to transform their lives, all this sort of thing. And then when you say, well, what does it involve? They'll always say, I don't want to ruin it for you. I don't want to spoil the experience, or it's not something that can be put into words, those sorts of things. And so that's a problem, particularly when the seminars can be incredibly stressful for some people. And there have been claims of psychological harm for the last 50 years since these things have been around. So if a person goes in and they don't know what they're signing up for and they have a negative reaction to it, it can be very problematic.
For example, if you come to, as a therapist, I give out an informed consent that describes in great detail any intervention that I might want to use and what are the possible harms of therapy. Also, what are the benefits? But then we make very clear to mention that no benefits are guaranteed. Breakthroughs are not guaranteed. And it's not the fault of the client or the therapist if that doesn't happen, such is the nature of the work. And in Europe, most LGATs do not have any informed consent. They just have you.
No, so often they will have a waiver. So some of the bigger organizations do have a waiver that they ask participants to sign. I would say that the waivers are superficially providing information, but don't actually provide information on the nature of the interaction. So they might say, on day 1, this will be discussed. And then on day 2, we'll do exercise. Then on day 3, but it's only by listening to the way that the trainer or the leader interacts with participants that you really get a sense of what the seminars are about. And that's missing from the disclaimers. I also, from the ones that I've looked at as well, I don't know where they're getting their figures from. They say one person in 100,000 has a very bad reaction. And then you kind of say to yourself, well, what research is this based on? It hasn't been published anywhere. I can't find it. So I think they vastly underestimate the risks. And I think that they vastly overestimate the benefits. If you go and look at the websites of some of the bigger organizations, some of them have got sections of their website called independent research. And anyone that knows anything about research can look at the studies that they're citing and realize that they are very poor quality. They can be manipulating the data. These are not things that you can trust. And then when there is a very well-designed published study on the organization and it says that there's no long-term benefits and there's almost no short-term benefits at all, that study isn't on the website, which that is a problem in terms of informed consent as well. I mean, the last thing that I would say, Daniel Kahneman, I don't know if you're familiar with the book Thinking Fast and Slow. He mentions that research has been done that when we overvalue a technology, we also underestimate its risks. So what happens is people come out of these seminars and they are on top of the world. They're euphoric, they're confident, they feel like they're forever transformed. And then they go in and they're explaining to their family and friends about participating. They are not going to give them a very accurate sense of maybe what the risks are involved, even if they understood what those risks are. So I think that those are some of the problems, and that's before you even get onto the sort of coercive control and the thought reform techniques that are being used as well.
Just to put a button on it, the waiver is really for the LGATs' own protection,
yes.
Right? Whereas an informed consent would be for the participant to understand what they're getting themselves into. And
yes.
Whereas a waiver is just to avoid legal responsibility.
Well, that would be some might say cynical view, but I don't think it's all. I think it's a very fair way of looking at it, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the coercion, because I watched your trainings, and good PowerPoints, by the way. I always love a good deck, so thank you for that.
Sure.
And if you could describe, for those of us who have not had the privilege of spending, 2 days being yelled at by a person they hardly know, what is kind of like what goes on there in over a 3-day period? Give me a day one. I show up day one. What's happening to me?
So day one, you'll arrive and you won't really know what's going on because nobody's told you, and that's a very deliberate thing. So often you'll kind of be quite uncertain and wandering around and what's gonna happen. You'll be let into the room. It'll often be a hotel boardroom or something like that. There'll be these very neatly sort of set up rows of chairs, and I mean, in some of the organizations, the degree to which this was done was, incredibly pedantic. Like there had to be a certain number of millimeters apart and the right angles, and so everything's set up to look like there's this incredible technology and something wonderful is about to happen. Then people will file in and they'll sit on chairs. There's usually like a podium and a lectern where somebody can speak from. And then you'll go and you'll take your seat, depending on the seminar. And there are slight differences between them. There's kind of the EST landmark stream, and then there's the LifeSpring stream. And they're similar but distinct. So it kind of depends on which one you're at. And then a trainer will tend to come in. The trainer will almost always present themselves as an authority. This is a really important thing. They often are very well dressed. They're well groomed. Their chests are out. The way that they carry themselves, there's an air of superiority and confidence about them. And typically the trainer will spend the first bit of the training, convincing participants that they don't really know much, and that's he or she, the trainer, knows everything about what is about to happen, and that immediately places people in sort of a position of inferiority. They'll often spend a lot of time speaking about the rules, and again, that Fight Club reference. They spend a lot of time running through the rules of the seminar, and often it's things like, if you want to ask a question, you need to raise your hand, you need to wait for somebody to bring you a microphone, then you have to stand up, you have to hold the microphone a certain distance from your face, and then you need to, when you give them permission, then you can speak. You're not allowed to speak to anyone next to you, you're not allowed to speak to anyone behind you, you're not allowed to take any notes, which is quite an important thing that we can talk about.
And the no notes is just because secrets. They don't want you to take this home and show anybody.
Well, I think that there's that element to it. So they don't necessarily want people sharing things, but I think that there's another important thing that we can speak about, which relates to something called the peak end rule. Again, something that Daniel Kahneman speaks about. So in brief, the seminar is incredibly stressful and unpleasant, and lots of things happen that are not great if you just look at the descriptions of what happens. But people don't write those things down. So at the end, they're pushed into this euphoric state. So the peak end rule, which is something that Daniel Kahneman speaks about, is the idea that we remember things not necessarily by how they occurred, but how they felt at the peak and at the end. And so at the end, people are feeling great and amazing and wonderful, and they're tired and they're exhausted and they've had so much information thrown at them, so they can't really remember things well. So their memory of the event is based more on that euphoria at the end than it is on the details of actually what took place. If they had the notes, they'd be able to look back and go, oh yeah, I remember when that person was shouting at this other person or X, Y, and Z. So it allows a reality check. So as a therapist, you must have dealt with people and maybe used cognitive therapy or CBT or that sort of thing. And you say to them, well, let's go look at the evidence of what happened. And in that case,
you can't check the facts, is what we say in DBT. Let's check the facts.
Exactly. So you can't check the facts if you're not allowed to write anything down. So I think that it serves that purpose as well.
Does writing it down probably helps organize things for the individual, and is somewhat it takes some of the stress off, right? I know if I journal something and I kind of organize my mind a little bit, as opposed to a 10-hour session, it's just information overload. I can't remember anything. I just know that I heard too much stuff and I'm flooded.
Absolutely. So I think it contributes to the stress. I think it removes a sense of control that participants may have otherwise had. But something very important about it from a persuasion perspective is that it reduces the ability of participants to think critically about what they've been told, because they can't take that information later and reflect on it and think about it and speak to other people about it after the seminar. It's all just, you're sitting there from 9 a.m. until 10, 12, 2 the next morning sometimes, with very brief breaks, very little time for eating and drinking and that sort of thing. Often during the short breaks that are given, they'll give people exercises that they've got to do. So you are overloaded with information. And so not being able to write it down reduces the motivation of people to think critically. And based on the elaboration likelihood model, which is a model that I use quite a lot in explaining the influence that goes on, when your motivation or your ability to think about something critically is undermined, you're more likely to rely on cognitive shortcuts or heuristics or that sort of thing. So by getting people really tired, it's hard to think. By giving them so much information, and it's quite like jargon filled and, philosophically complicated and contradictory and weird, and you don't have any time to think this through. So it makes it far more likely that you're going to go, okay, how do I make sense of what's going on in this room? I can get social proof. I can look around and see what other people are doing. And because they can't speak to each other, you may think everyone's agreeing with what this person is saying. Additionally, there are often plants among the room, or people that are retaking the seminar that are already advocates of it, and they know what the right answers are to give. So they are saying the right things. They're not getting shouted at. They're using the right language. And so you start, basing your behavior on what they're doing. Again, as I said earlier, the leader comes in and presents himself or herself as this incredible authority. And so a common heuristic is to outsource your thinking to an authority figure. You're like, okay, I think this person knows what's going on. I'm going to trust them instead. And that becomes more likely if your motivation and your ability to think about things for yourself is undermined. They also spend a lot of time, the seminar leaders, basically telling you that you're stupid. They'll say things like, don't analyze, don't come from your head, come from your heart. Understanding is the booby prize. Stop being reasonable. Like, where's reasonableness got you? So they really undermine critical thinking. And then the major heuristic, and just for your viewers, what I mean by heuristic is kind of a shortcut. As opposed to running through all the evidence, you kind of use something else to decide whether you believe something or not. The major heuristic that's being used is the really positive feeling at the end of the seminar. So often we make decisions. Yeah. So when you're feeling euphoric and confident and energized and, creative and all that sort of thing, often we decide whether something's good or bad based on how we're feeling. We're more likely to do that if we're tired and depleted and we've been convinced that we're never going to understand this thing. And we're like, okay, well, I'm going to use this good feeling as the indicator of whether this thing was a good idea or not.
So these are 10 to 11 hour days. Food intake is limited. Bathroom breaks are not advised. Can't write anything down. High stress
Yeah.
for a couple days. And then tell me a little bit about some of the interventions, because I mean, I've had a number of friends who have been to the forum, and I've been sold the hard. It almost feels like multi-level marketing with the amount of people who are trying to get you downstream from them, and
Yeah.
purchasing and then upselling you on things. And these are things I would never do as a therapist, the type of interventions that are being used. Also in public, right? I mean, the exercises that are that participants are being encouraged to use over the first couple of days before the love bomb on the third day. And it's just like explosions of dopamine everywhere. Just some of the stressful exercises.
So, I mean, there's something called the fear exercise. So there's quite a lot of guided visualization exercises that are used, and often it's used to calm people down after stressful exercise, but those visualization exercises can be quite stressful in themselves. And this is going to sound like it's relatively benign, but if you read the descriptions, and journalists from Paris and London and Sydney and all over the world from over a period of 30, 40 years, whatever, have given these descriptions of how people respond to this exercise. It's quite extreme. So the seminar leader will run the group of people through this exercise where they say, imagine that you're really frightened of the people sitting next to you. Then start imagining that you're afraid of the people that are around them. And then, eventually it's the whole city, and then the country, and then the world, and then the whatever. And it's obviously done in a very compelling way, because the descriptions reveal that there are people that are trembling and crying and screaming as they are, going through this visualization exercise. And this goes on for, I'm not quite sure how long, probably 20 minutes, 30 minutes or something like that. And then right at the end, the stress is abruptly removed. And the seminar leader says, well, actually this was just kind of a joke. And now imagine that everyone's afraid of you, and people feel really empowered. And I would say that's exercise is a very nice sort of micro version of what the entire seminar involves, is a period of high stress, suddenly replaced with stress removal and something quite positive. And it tends to lead to these elevated states in participants. So that's one of the things that happens. I think one of the other things that participants find very stressful is sharing. So, Lifton would call this cult of confession as one of his conditions of thought reform, but they call it sharing. I see it more as a public confessional. So basically, participants will stand up and they'll be encouraged to share something about what's going on in their lives. So you've got the trainer and you've got the participants, and there can be dozens to sometimes hundreds of people in the room at a given time. So a participant might say something like, I'm really having problems with my daughter. And a huge thing that's emphasized in ELGATs is this idea of taking responsibility. And so almost regardless of what the person says, a person can say, I was raped when I was 8 years old. And the seminar leader will basically say to them, you need to be responsible for that. And often it's communicated in a way that could reasonably be interpreted to be generating guilt and shame and blame in the person. From the descriptions given by journalists and bloggers and various people that have been through these seminars, that's how it's seen by the participants. So, you might have a person, and there's an example, there are numerous examples in my PhD. Pages 192 to 312 is just on the stress generated.
By the way, though, I've never seen a thesis as long as yours. It's like 400 pages, my guy.
It shouldn't be that long, though. Well, I mean, I have bipolar disorder, so sometimes when I'm manic, things become over-inclusive. If I had a better editor, then it would be shorter. So.
I want to say that you managed to like harness your hypomania for good in your writing, because
I know it still could have been a little bit. Well, I mean, not to plug my book, but I have just released a book that's about 160 pages that I feel like I've really kind of.
By the way, congratulations on writing that book. I saw that just came out, and so that's quite an achievement. And even just to go from 300 pages to 160 is
actually
in and of
500
itself.
to 160. So I think I did okay. But
what's so interesting to me, though, I just want to ask this one question. It seems like so much of this is like Scientology and Landmark, and then there's like elements of Nexium here with being at cause, which is you are responsible for everything that happens to you, including your feelings. And it's very much like we say to women, like, well, if she wasn't wearing such a short skirt, she wouldn't have attracted so much attention. But you're talking about an 8-year-old.
Yeah. Well, so the history of EST, and I mean, it's pretty well documented. You can read Werner Erhard's authorized biography by Bartley, and Scientology is spoken about openly. I mean, it's mentioned dozens and dozens and dozens of times as an influence. There's a book called The Book of EST written by Luke Reinhardt, and endorsed by Erhard. And it says one of his major influences was Scientology. So there have been a couple of people that have recently left Landmark, and they've had that conversation, and I don't think anyone denies the fact that EST was influenced significantly by Scientology. Nexium certainly was influenced by Landmark as well. So that idea of taking responsibility is what you will see. I gave a definition of ELGATs earlier on. That's something that exists in all of them. You are responsible for anything. So going back to the example that I was giving, there's one example, and there are multiple examples like this where a person says, on day 3, the person couldn't take it any longer when one of the participants stood up and said that he'd been raped by his brother his entire childhood, and the trainer just shouted back at him and told him that he needed to get over himself and stop feeling sorry for himself, and there's no such thing as this rape, and there's no such thing as a victim, and that kind of thing. And these things happen over and over and over again. So my view is that these seminars have evolved to generate psychological stress in participants. And if you look at the influences on these seminars, you can kind of see why that's a fairly reasonable thing to believe, and why they aren't doing the extremely abusive things that were done in the late 60s and early 70s, because those seminars were sued into oblivion because they were doing such ridiculous stuff. I just think now they've become better at realizing, okay, we can still generate a lot of stress. We don't even need to scream at people. We just need to twist the knife and kind of ask them the right questions and make them, people are so vulnerable to guilt and shame and inadequacy and that sort of thing. If you've got a skilled person standing there and you've got a whole room of people that apparently seem to agree with what this person's saying, and you are saying to this person, well, didn't you do something about it? What could you have done differently? How did you bring this into your life? That sort of thing. You don't have to scream at somebody to make them feel an incredible amount of psychological stress.
Also, what I'm picking up on there is like a real thread here with this accepting responsibility, that it's like this element of ableism where like we're giving you the technology, and if you don't have a breakthrough, it's entirely your fault.
Yeah, it's a wonderful little system that they've got going where everyone is responsible for everything that happens in their lives, pretty much to the degree of choosing their parents. But if the seminar doesn't work, then it's not our responsibility. Like, they aren't responsible for anything. The participants are responsible for everything. So it's an incredible way of placing blame on other people. And then they tend to count the hits and ignore the misses. So it's a case of, these are all these people that had an amazing time and thought it was fantastic. Great. Fine. I accept that some people may have had a fantastic time and whatever. Okay. What about the people that didn't? Let's have a real honest look at those people. And that's really where therapy and these sorts of seminars differ. They're not regulated in any way. You can wake up tomorrow and say, okay, I'm going to become an ELGAT leader and start an organization, which is how most of them do start. Somebody goes to the seminars for a while, learns the the scripts because it's very scripted and structured, and then they just replicate it somewhere else. I had somebody calling me yesterday from Taiwan and saying that they're doing basically LifeSpring seminars all over Taiwan. I'm doing a live stream on Instagram tomorrow with a psychologist from Iran. And there's this huge organization in Iran that is basically doing LifeSpring seminars. And these people just replicate. I did a seminar in 2010 in South Africa. There was kind of a combination of EST, but mainly, again, LifeSpring. But this person's not claiming any affiliation. They've just got the scripts and they've started this thing on their own. And there's no real incentive for them to worry about people being harmed other than the profits incentive. And it seems to be that when people are harmed, every person that is harmed is not going to have the emotional fortitude and the financial backing and all that sort of thing to be able to actually do something about it. So it's a small percentage of people that end up suing and that sort of thing. And in those circumstances, it seems that these organizations make some sort of deal. They settle out of court and they say to the person, you can't talk about this ever again. And they keep it quiet, which is, again, problematic from an informed consent perspective, because therapists shouldn't be doing that. They should be saying, these are the risks. Let's have a real good look at them and give people a good sense of what they're getting into.
Landmark is a notoriously litigious organization. I'm just wondering, have you had any fun cease and desist letters that you could share with us?
I haven't. I tend not to speak about Landmark. I prefer to speak about Est and Werner Out and Associates. They're no longer around anymore. A woman, Ann Peterson's just written a book called "Is This a Cult?" And a bunch of former Landmark employees that I've interacted with quite a lot now. A couple of them had podcasts. They've been having very open discussions about some of the challenges that they've experienced and about the difficulty of coming out of the organization and trying to reconcile, what they really believed in for such a long period of time. But I've never called them a cult, and I won't. And it seems like there are other people that are being a lot more openly and I don't want to say reckless about their criticisms, but I'm very careful about how I make statements. I think, in the US particularly, freedom of speech is a big thing. We have to be able to have these conversations. I don't want to be reckless about saying things, but if there's evidence and I can call some things into question, then I will.
One of the things I really liked in your training is you threw up a bell curve, and you showed over there that probably the majority of people who go to an LGAT are going to have either a neutral or a short-term net positive experience before it goes away. And then I'm wondering for the I don't know, 20% or 10% of people who are coming in with a lot of trauma, unmetabolized, or have some, susceptibility to mania or a hypomanic episode. You've discussed informed consent. I'm wondering if one of these LGATs came to you and they were like, John, help us design a safer program. They might not do that because literally, like, they want to activate people's fight. They want to get people all the way up in order to bring them all the way down to have the breakthrough. But besides informed consent, what else could we be doing?
So my theory is that what these seminars are doing is that they're generating a lot of stress, and that the stress, as a response to the stress, your brain is producing dopamine, among other things, to make you feel like you can deal with the situation. And then right at the end, when the stress is removed and replaced with love, you have this sort of dopamine rush. And that's what leads to these powerful transformations, but also sometimes leads to psychosis in a small percentage of people. And then you have others that struggle with depression and maybe manic type behavior. And and those kinds of things. So if we assume that's hypothesis is valid, stress is the secret ingredient in the seminars. So how do you know how a person's going to, if a person's going to be stressed or not? You don't know about the person's history. You don't know if I'm talking about, being beaten by an alcoholic father, for example, and I'm the person sharing, then somebody sitting over there that's, got parents that have never touched alcohol and have never beaten them, maybe that's not something that, is going to affect them as much. If I'm talking about being raped as whatever by my uncle, and somebody there is sitting there and it happened to them as well, then that's going to generate a lot more stress in them. So the backgrounds of people are very difficult to really know beforehand. You don't really know about the genetic makeups and the neurobiological makeups of each of the people. So they might say, okay, well, we're going to screen out people that have been diagnosed with depression or bipolar disorder. I think the median age of diagnosis for bipolar disorder is about 25. I mean, some people get diagnosed when they're in their mid-30s, 40s, whatever. So there's still a big percentage of people that may have the propensity to develop some of these disorders, but they've just never been through something stressful enough to kick it off. And a lot of these disorders operate based on the diathesis stress model. So there's a predisposition, you throw stress against that genetic predisposition, and that's when the disorder kind of kicks into gear. So how do you screen people for that? Okay, so then that's the one thing. The other possibility is that you change what's going on in the seminars. And I know that Ann Peterson and a bunch of people are trying to look into the personal development industry, and there's a movement called Seek Safely. And so it's for people that want to do this personal development, but they want to try to do it in a safer way. If what your trainings are offering is that euphoria, and if it's a stress-generated dopamine high, then you don't get it without the stress. I mean, there are more direct ways to stimulate those pathways. I mean, you can go on an ayahuasca retreat, or you can give people various drugs, and then you're not using stress as the middle or the intermediary to start getting the dopamine and various other things elevated. If you just give people drugs, then that will happen. I don't know how many people would.
John, I think you're onto something.
Yeah.
So it doesn't cost as much. Drugs are way cheaper than an LGAT.
The short answer is everyone should take. No, I'm joking, obviously. But if you know what I mean, so there are ways of stimulating those pathways that don't involve using stress as the thing that gets those pathways to be stimulated. Because after the seminars ended, if you had to take a drug and your dopamine levels go up or your serotonin levels go up or whatever the case is, and then afterwards you kind of come down from it, there's no trauma lingering from that unless you've done something, quite wild while you were high. But if the way that change in your neurochemistry took place was through these really long days and conversations and stress and seeing other people crying and screaming and whatever, then that is going to stick with you after the neurochemistry maybe settles back down to normal. So I think that there are challenges with using that model. And I also don't think that the organizations want people to go, woo. I think that they want them to go like, wow, like as they do, like absolutely crazy about, and then they run out and they tell other people. It's built into their model of marketing and sales and all that sort of thing. So I don't know how you do it without the risky part.
Hypomanic euphoria kind of is the goal. Whereas like I'm thinking if it's like, as a therapist, we always have to go to these trainings. So I've done like, internal family systems will have like a 5-day training where it's 8 hours a day and you have a ton of breaks. There's a lot of food. You're always getting together to process what's going on. You're taking notes. You have like separate groups to process. You have big groups to process. There's like a large amount of staff. It's very friendly. And it's basically they're very safe ways. You get up and move your body, right? You stop by 5:00 p.m. You start at 9 a.m. Get ample time for sleep because it's skill based as opposed to experientially based.
Well, exactly. And when they say experiential, that's just a synonym for euphoria. It's and I mean, I mentioned earlier that I have bipolar disorder, and that's really what gave me the insights into these seminars. 3 of the major triggers for hypermania and mania are psychological stress, sleep disruption, and goal attainment. And those are the things that you see happening in these seminars. So there's this huge psychological stress. You tend not to sleep well. I mean, you said earlier that they were 10-hour days. They're from 9 until at least 10. So that's 13 hours. And they're usually 11, 12, sometimes even longer. They always give you homework as well. So you leave that room and then you've got homeworks and you stimulated as a result of everything that's been going on. So often it's very difficult to sleep. So there's sleep disruption. And then on the final day, there's a huge sense of reward and goal attainment, and you've graduated and you're wonderful, and dancing and hugging and music and that sort of thing. And the trainer steps down from the platform. This person who's been, in my view, quite abusive for 3 or 4 days. And suddenly this person says, I'm like all of you. And often they cry and they just say, thank you for letting me serve you. And it's this real switch. So they've got these triggers for hypermania and mania. And then if you look at what they call transformation, it looks identical to hypermania. So you've got euphoria, you've got the shift in perspective, this positive shift in perspective. So people will say, I came out and I was massively confident, or my mother suddenly was this wonderful person. She hadn't been like that before. There's confidence, there's energy. So people need less sleep. They're highly motivated. They're driven to achieve goals, which are all things you see in hypermania and mania. There's decisiveness. So people are making big decisions in their lives. They often will change their jobs. Sometimes, at quite an alarming rate, you see people getting divorced immediately after participating. And this is such kind of classic manic type behavior where people just quit their jobs after 15 years or, quit their husbands or wives after 20 years. And then you see at the extreme of it, you see psychosis, which again is what you see at the extreme side of mania. And so I think it was in 1987, one of the researchers on ELGATs, Morton Lieberman from the University of Chicago eventually, but I mean, he said, there's no reason for us to assume, based on the evidence we've got at the moment, so in 1987, that these trainings couldn't hurt people or couldn't cause psychiatric harm. Like, there's no reason for us to think that they couldn't, but right now we can't explain why what's happening in the seminars is leading to these sorts of results. And people had been reporting psychosis and depression and suicides and, manic type behavior. My theory, the dopaminergic defense, gives a very clear understanding of how that can happen. So yeah.
How did you come to this? Because I know you had your personal experience, but the dopaminergic defense is not like a new hypothesis. Is that correct?
It is. So that's something that I put forward.
Okay. Give it, Dr. John Hunter, give it to me. Give me your definition of this hypothesis. I have so many questions here.
All right. So this is what my thinking was. I was like, okay, these seminars involve triggers for bipolar disorder, stress, sleep disruption, goal attainment, and they involve symptoms of the elevated states of bipolar disorder, and sometimes actually of the lower states, depressive symptoms. So I kind of said to myself, okay, well, what are some of the theories that are quite prominent in explaining bipolar disorder? There were 2 that I looked at. So the first one was an old psychoanalytic theory by somebody named Carl Abraham, who was a student of Freud's. And I think this was put forward in 1911. It's called the manic defense hypothesis. And so they didn't have an understanding of the brain really at that time, but they could observe what was going on. And so their observation was people that are bipolar, people that have manic depression, which is what bipolar disorder was called at the time, they tend to, have set very high standards for themselves and be wounded quite easily. It seems like mania is an overcompensation of a defense against negative feelings. So if a person's feeling really negative about themselves, guilt, shame, inadequacy, fear, all those sorts of things, think of the psychodynamic idea of an unconscious force that counteracts those negative feelings. So the idea that Abraham put forward was that unconscious force became too powerful, and instead of just sort of working against the negative feelings pushing you down, it pushes you too far, and that's what mania is. So the idea that mania as a defense was the one thing. The other theory, which is far more recent, is the dopamine hypothesis of bipolar disorder. And there's quite a lot of evidence that an elevation in dopamine leads to mania, or at least symptoms that look a lot like mania. Can I run through a little bit of that evidence? Maybe.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it, but others may not be. So let's get in there.
Yeah, so some of the evidence is things like levodopa, which is a drug that's often given to people with Parkinson's disease. People with Parkinson's disease, neurons that produce dopamine in the substantia nigra have broken down, and that leads to these problems with movement. And actually, a lot of people with Parkinson's have problems with mood as well. They often have depressed mood because of a lack of dopamine. So people that were given levodopa or L-dopa often experience hypermanic type symptoms. If you give levodopa to people with bipolar disorder, you start seeing hypermanic symptoms pretty much immediately. If you give amphetamines, which elevate dopamine, to pretty much anyone, you start seeing hypermanic type symptoms. Then if you look at, for example, there've been studies where they've stimulated the ventral tegmental area, which is another part of the brain that produces dopamine in the reward pathway, in people with obsessive compulsive disorder. And these people have started to display hypermanic type of symptoms. With brain imaging studies, they found that dopamine receptors tend to be like very active or very open and whatever during manic episodes. And they've noticed that transporters tend to be overactive in depressive phases. So, I mean, I don't want to go into that in too much detail, but if there are lots of receptors, it means that dopamine signaling is going to be high. And if there are lots of transporters, it means that dopamine signaling is going to be relatively low. And then a very interesting one. Yep.
I just want the converse of this is also true, right? Like if you take somebody and you give them certain like first generation antipsychotic medication, they will have like Parkinsonian like
Yes.
movements, correct? Because the
Yes.
dopamine is so limited.
Exactly. And also people that are given even the atypical antipsychotics, you'll often see people really struggling with mood. So their moods will become quite low as a result of taking these drugs that are restricting dopamine signaling, among other things. Then you've got these really interesting situations where you get some people that have got Parkinson's disease and bipolar disorder, which is pretty rough. I don't know who's making the decisions up there, but that doesn't seem cool. But these people, there have been case studies where these people that are really battling with movements, so one of your dopamine pathways has got a lot to do with voluntary movements, the nigrostriatal pathway, and one of your dopamine pathways has got a lot more to do with mood, so that's the mesolimbic pathway. And they're kind of next to each other, and the dopamine is sort of shared across them to some degree. But they found that in people with Parkinson's disease, when they have manic episodes, their movement sometimes improves. And that's a strong indicator that dopamine is being elevated during the manic episodes. I think the last thing that probably is quite a good indicator is that the dopamine pathways, we know from a lot of research, have got a lot to do with addiction. So substance use disorders. I think based on a study of 17 countries, one study that I looked at said that the rate of substance use disorders in the general population is about 7%. Among people with bipolar disorder, it's about 55%. So the rate of substance use disorders is incredibly high among people with bipolar disorder. And it seems that may be because similar pathways are involved. So that gives us a sense that dopamine's got, that may play a role. I mean, these are still hypotheses that haven't been completely established, but there's good reason to think that. And if not that they cause mania, that an elevation in dopamine can certainly lead to symptoms that look a lot like hypermania and mania. So I was like, okay, great. I know what the conditions of the training are. I know that dopamine apparently leads to some of these symptoms. Is there any relationship between these three things, stress, sleep disruption, and goal attainment, and dopamine? And so when you start looking at the literature, it's quite clear. And it's initially quite confusing because when I went and spoke to people that I thought were authoritative at the time, they said, no, stress leads to depletion in dopamine. And that's true if it's chronic stress. Mm-hmm. So if you stress a person for a long time and that stress is kind of inescapable, I think of it kind of like perspiration. When you initially running whatever and you need your body to cool down, your body is going to produce perspiration and that's going to be useful. But if you keep doing that forever, eventually your body's just going to go, well, I can't do this anymore. So with dopamine, there's quite a lot of research that shows that acute stress or short-term stress that is escapable leads to an elevation in dopamine. And that kind of makes sense as well from a homeostatic perspective, because an elevation in dopamine makes you feel optimistic. It makes you feel energized. It makes you feel confident, makes you feel like you can deal with anything. Think about, the effects of taking cocaine or that sort of thing. People feel bulletproof. So
I was thinking about a cold plunge, which is very popular in America right now.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of shady research out there, but it's very clear that the pain of the cold plunge causes a release in dopamine. And after 4 minutes in 48-degree water, everybody is euphoric because it's an acute pain that you can get out of and then you feel beautiful. Or cocaine, also good.
Exactly. And so Anna Lemke in her book, Dopamine Nation, speaks about that. And I do refer to it in my book as well, talking about physical pain leading to the same sort of response. But your body doesn't kind of know the difference between physical pain and psychological pain. It's the same thing. And the dopamine response to psychological pain makes sense because you want to feel like, I think that I can get through this, I can deal with it. And an LGAT is a very abnormal environment. So what you've got is an abnormal response to an abnormal situation. There's a quote by Viktor Frankle in Man's Search for Meaning. He says, an abnormal response to an abnormal situation is normal. And I think that that's exactly what's going on in LGATs. They put you in this very strange, extreme situation, and your body and your brain responds in a very extreme way, and you have this amazing experience afterwards, and you think that something special has happened. And, you can't say that it wasn't special, but you might be able to explain that special experience in quite a logical way, as opposed to thinking that some sort of mystical transformation has occurred.
It's not a secret technology. It's it's basically physiological reactions to stress.
This is my view to it, and I also don't want to be super cynical about it, because I do think that
you can be cynical here. This is fine. I want to create a space for all of your cynicism and skepticism to land. We've got big shoulders here.
But I think that any big event can serve as a catalyst for change. So it's not impossible. And I've spoken to people who have been through these seminars, and it allowed them to make a big change. And, and they will look back and say that was a great thing. And you can't argue that allowing somebody to feel empowered to maybe make a decision that they wouldn't have otherwise made, and that decision's worked out well for them, you can't take that away from the person and say, well, actually, no, that the seminar didn't help, because I really think that it did. But the flip side is that, well, what you've got to understand is that the person just took a risk and it worked out. But the nature of risk is that it's risky. So if you're going to count that one, you also have to count the person who took a major risk and it totally blew up for them. And there are examples of people going into work feeling this huge level of confidence, and they start telling their managers what to do, and they take on tasks that they that they can't accomplish, and they just get themselves into huge amounts of trouble, or they spend money that they don't have. And so you've got to weigh those things up together. You can't just look at the positive outcomes. You have to look at the negative outcomes and the occasional disasters as well.
Also, the type of person, obviously, if your company forces everyone to go to an LGAT, then you're in for it. But it's a self-selecting crowd of vulnerable people who are looking to make a change and are often, it's not always the most grounded sort of person who's willing to spend $5,000 for a 3-day workshop to begin with, is what I'm saying.
I'm not sure. There was a study done in the 1980s or maybe in 1991 that you could look at, and there were some differences between controls and the people that ended up taking part. But I think that there's some truth to that, but we've got to be careful with it, because it sometimes creates the impression that it's like, don't worry, you're safe as like a normal person, like you're okay.
Right.
It's like these people that are vulnerable to it. And if you look at there've been a number of studies that have looked at the demographics of participants. So all of them will say about 70% of participants had college degrees. Maybe another 20% have got postgraduate or professional qualifications. Maybe only 5 to 10% no qualification. More female than male. It tends to be based on those studies, but I mean, those were 30 years ago, those studies. But then, you mentioned that maybe your employers just asked you to take part. I think that's an important thing to realize as well, that the chapter in Margaret Singer's book, Cults in Our Midst, chapter 8, on LGATs is called Intruding into the Workplace, because so often it is an employer who says to their employees, you guys have all got to take partners. And so in that case, you can't say that these people are greater seekers than anyone else. They just happen to be at an organization and these are organizations like Reebok and Lululemon and Panda Express. And, there's some like big organizations. And working in South Africa, I've spoken to some people in HR at some really big organizations that, like accounting firms that you wouldn't think would be into this sort of thing. And they're like, oh yeah, we had to do something quite similar to that. So I think there's that. And then I also think that because so many people are invited without a real sense of what's going to happen, it also makes it difficult for people that would maybe be discerning to kind of say, well, this is not something that I'm interested in. The other thing is, and it happens very commonly, and you obviously know, a symptom of hypermania and mania is often overspending or being incredibly generous. It's often the case that the person recruiting you so wants your life to be transformed that they say, I will pay for you, or the $1,000 or whatever it is for you. And often they don't have the money to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you think you could actually further study the dopamine defense hypothesis? Like, what would be your next step to creating some sort of study or a way to test it?
Again, referring back to Margaret Singer, she speaks about studies on cults. And again, I'm not calling these groups cults, but that it requires impermissible experiments. So in order to do research, you have to get an informed consent. And so
do you think we could do like a landmark for rats and mice? Is that something we could work on?
Yeah, but I think that research has been done. So that's the research that's kind of led to my hypothesis. So you can kind of say you put people through stress and then you remove the stress and dopamine elevates. So when they do that in rats, it's not like they say to them, you don't really look very good in that, fur coats or whatever. You can't make a rat feel bad about itself. So you're generating social stress in different ways. So they'll use like a tail pinch. So they'll kind of pinch the rat's tail, or they may bring in like an aggressive other rat, or they'll put a cat or the the smell of a cat in a cage nearby, and that will stress them out. And so it's not a perfect proxy. So it's very difficult. And doing research on LGATs themselves, you'd have to go to them and say, okay, you guys are the gatekeepers. I'd like to do some research on you. And they'd be like, okay, well, what other stuff have you done? And I could say, well, go look at my website. I don't know if they're going to be super
I don't think they're down for it.
to have me. Yeah. So
well, how would they, because you say this, and obviously this is true, is that there's the data on the efficacy and the long-term impact of an LGAT is not wonderful. If they wanted to get some good data, how would they go about that?
So they could contact researchers and I genuinely think that Earhart did this in the late 80s. I think that he went and he got hold of researchers, and they said to him, fine, we're happy to do this research, but we want complete independence. You can't. And based on the results, those researchers clearly did have independence. They weren't swayed because the results are not positive. I mean, they really are as damning as you could imagine. So I think that they could approach universities and say, we'd like you to do some research on our organizations. I think that the universities could get funding. I don't even think that the organizations themselves would have to fund the research. And I think that there are things that they could do. The history of it, I mean, we've mentioned some of the studies published on certain sites, but I mean, I found that some of the information provided has not only been, there hasn't just been a lack, but to me, it's been deliberately misleading. There was an episode called Conversations on Compassion with Werner Erhard, and James Doty, a professor at Stanford University, professor of neurosurgery, so also authority figure, very easy to believe if you don't actually look into the detail. And they're having this conversation, and he says, if you know anything about EST, and if you've looked into the Landmark Forum, you'll realize that innumerable studies have been done that have demonstrated very scientifically the incredible value that these sorts of seminars have had on literally hundreds of thousands of people and changed millions of lives, which is just flat out not true. And I mean, I contacted him and I asked him, and he literally sent me an email that said, I don't know, I don't remember saying that, and if I did say it, it's not true. So you've got this person with incredible authority status saying this, and people are going to listen to that. People are going to, and I know I've spoken to people that have heard that and have come at me and said, well, who are you to say that, this professor of neurosurgery at Stanford said X, Y, and Z? And I'm like, well, I've been looking into these things for a long time. I can't find those studies. If those innumerable scientific studies exist, why are they not on the website? They've got a section of the websites that says independent research. Surely they'd put the strong scientific studies. None of the studies that they've got there have been peer-reviewed. None of the studies that they've got there have been published in academic journals. If you're a professor of neurosurgery at Stanford University, you know what a very scientific study is. It's not something that a marketing company has put together and has never been peer-reviewed. So like that sort of thing makes me not very optimistic that they would look at high-quality research on their processes.
Yeah. Okay. I have a quasi silly question for you, which is, this is your second career. Now, I think you've really landed here. I mean, you have the book, you're a researcher, you're doing great work. Do you have, if you were going to switch careers again, asking for a friend here, what would be your third career?
Sure. I'm actually so happy with what I'm doing. And I mean, my first career was in finance. So
right. What type of finance were you doing? Were you an accountant? Were you a wealth manager? What was it?
Well, I had a degree in finance. So I think this is what led to my bipolar disorder. My first manic episode was because I couldn't get a job in investment banking. So I ended up doing things like management accounting. I worked as a management consultant, sort of at McKinsey. I was kind of at a BE partner to McKinsey for a while.
You're McKinsey adjacent.
McKinsey adjacent. Yeah. So I did that sort of thing, but I don't have a very good sense of trying to make money. So I wasn't very well suited to that qualification.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment, if I had to make changes in my career, I think I'd like to do a lot more advocacy for bipolar disorder. I think that's something that's really missing in South Africa. It's very poorly understood. So yeah, something around that. But yeah, I love lecturing. I love interacting with the students, trying to get a bit of research done. And it's also it's humbling and very rewarding that, I did this research. I finished it in 2017 and I didn't think anyone would read it. I mean, 500 pages on this weird topic, and then somebody found it and then, passed it around, and then, suddenly I was testifying in a lawsuit in Arizona, and I was like, okay, well, so it's really been quite a lot of luck, but I think it's good. It's fun. It's nice. I get to meet interesting people, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you have another book in the works right now?
I don't, but I'm doing some research specifically on the troubled teen industry, which is something we haven't really spoken about. So LifeSpring-based seminars are used on, or certainly were used in a lot of what we called like the WASP programs. So the Worldwide Association of Specialty Programs was like an umbrella organization that had a lot of these programs and schools for troubled teens, and they basically just use LifeSpring ELGATs on these vulnerable teenagers. So we've said that there's some screening in some of these organizations now, and they'll say if you've got depression or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or psychosis, or you're on any medication, you shouldn't take part.
Yeah, but a teenager haven't gotten to that point yet.
Well, not only that, but I did some work on a trial for Spring Ridge Academy, and the feedback from the people running the organization was basically like 100% of the people that are at our program have got some sort of diagnosed mental health condition. They're all being medicated. Some of them I think are being incorrectly medicated, but they believe that they've all got some sort of mental health condition. Some of them are 14, 15, 16 years old, and they're putting them through these highly abusive programs, and there's just no regulation around it. It's completely insane.
Okay, well, we need that book. So,
but
let's get that research going, Doctor.
That's a possible next book. We'll see how this one, the current one, does. It's on a slightly controversial topic. So,
are you going to be touring? Are you planning on touring the States with this book?
I really don't. I mean, I'm not delusional enough to think that it's going to be that popular. If I get 100 people to buy it, I'll be very, very happy. So, after I've tapped out all my family and friends, I've got to maybe find a couple of other people that will.
Are you kidding? There are dozens of us interested in this book.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The reason why I ask is so the conceit of this podcast is that I bring people to my home and I make pizza for them. And I've been to South Africa. You guys are not known for your pizza. It's not. Okay.
I actually brought some. I was like, well, any excuse to get some pizza. So yeah.
So I just want to welcome you, invite you to come to Los Angeles, and I'll bring you. I have a beautiful outdoor pizza oven, and I'd love to make you some pizza sometime, and we can have this conversation again in person if that's possible.
Fantastic. Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
Same thing. If you're ever in Johannesburg, give me a shout. You've got a place to stay.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate your time, and keep up the good work. I really I've enjoyed all of it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Cheers.
Okay, John Hunter, Manufacturing Mania. That was a really good episode. I know I learned a lot. What I really appreciated about John was the personal story, what happened to him, and then how he took what happened to him, and he integrated that into a meaningful hypothesis, the dopamine hypothesis, that's out there in the streets and in the world helping people. So thanks to John Hunter. Thank you for watching this episode. Please subscribe to the Personal Pizza Podcast channel on YouTube and find me, Personal Pizza Podcast, on Instagram and on all your socials, and continue to watch and share. And I'm going to continue to finish this pizza, which is delightful. And cheerio.